Hey guys, it's me, Justin, and I'm going to be talking about my research paper, the big research paper for this class. The topic I chose was social handicap in individuals with disabilities. I started off just doing, disabilities in general. It kind of ended up leaning towards intellectual disabilities. But yeah, so we're talking about social handicap, which for most of us, we take our social skills for granted. The ability to communicate back and forth with others comes naturally. We're never really taught much about it. We just kind of learn as we're growing up. As humans, we're naturally social animals, and we're all expected to communicate in a variety of settings, such as school, work, family life, and personal relationships. It's a whole bunch all over the place that we have to do. On top of that, besides just verbal communication, such as hearing messages and sending messages, we're also expected to understand nonverbal cues, such as body language, facial expressions, gestures, etc. Even more so, a big social skill that people with disabilities have problems with is behavior management skills. I have a friend with a traumatic brain disorder, and he had really good vocab, good grammar, and all that. He knew how to talk, but what he lacked in was he had zero impulse control, and he would make a lot of girls uncomfortable with like his flirting, and he couldn't catch on to the cues that they were uncomfortable. So there's a whole bunch of things that come into play with social skills and a whole bunch of different settings that you have to apply those to. It's no wonder that throwing a disability and social handicap becomes a real problem. So there's lots of theories about, why, you know, intellectual disability can affect social skills. And one of the big ones that's tied with autism, for example, is the social gaze theory. And basically what that means is even as a baby, you can tell with babies that they are able to focus their gaze on things. If they want food, they're able to look directly at the food. And when we're talking to people, we're supposed to look directly at them, gaze into their eyes. But if you can't do that, then that ends up affecting you in more ways than one. Because, with the gaze and with the eyes, you're not only sending a message, but you're also receiving a message. So, while the ears only really receive the message and the mouth really only sends a message, the social gaze is a really big factor. So something like that affects many people with autism and other intellectual disabilities can really affect the social skills. Another thing that really affects the social skills of people with disabilities is that their peers don't really want to interact with them. And I thought this study was crazy. It was done in 1985 by Odom, Hyson, Jameson, and Strain. And basically what they did was they took typical students and they tried to prompt them to interact with their peers with disabilities. And long story short, they were willing to do it for a token system, but once that token system ended, they didn't want to interact with them at all. And I just find that pretty sad because it's hard enough for these individuals with disabilities to communicate with others in the first place, but they also have to battle the fact that most typical students don't really want to communicate with them. So as far as teaching social skills to students with disabilities, that can be accomplished in many ways. The most important thing, though, is that you do it in an authentic social environment. You can do so much direct instruction, but if you're not putting them in an authentic environment, and that's true for teaching about most subjects, then it's going to be really tough. A common thing that you see when teaching social skills is the I do, we do, you do method. So the teacher will model a social skill, and then she'll kind of work through it with the student, and then she'll watch as the student does it in action with other students. Gradual release is important when teaching social skills, of course. Before, like, you don't want to just send them out into the real world to practice these skills. You want to make sure that they have time to adjust to those and whatever. One tool that I found that was pretty interesting and helpful, it's verywellfamily.com. And what that is it shows a whole bunch of milestones that typical students should have accomplished by a certain age. For example, for 8-year-olds, it says that students are just starting to love being a part of a social group. Their friends tend to be the same gender and low in number. And it gives a whole bunch of information like that. It also talks about physical milestones and um, academic milestones, stuff like that. So, this isn't enough to really diagnose a student with anything, but as a parent, or even a teacher, you can look at this and kind of compare and see with your student, where's this student at compared to others? Is this student starting to fall into friend groups, or is this student still trying to just be by themselves alone? So, social role valorization is something that I thought was really interesting, and it's something that's really important to many people's social standings. So this includes things such as social image, having relationships, being socially integrated, and stuff like that. So there's 3 criteria within social role valorization, and we kind of want to focus on all of these to make sure that our students feel valued socially. The first one is ultimate functioning, and that basically just means having the individuals function on their own, independently and productively. Second criteria is the dignity of risk, and I think this is really important because as a human, we have the right to be able to take risks and make our own decisions on stuff like that. So you have to provide individuals with disabilities choice. If they, like, you can't restrict them from participating in an integrated society. So the more choices that they give, even if it's small or large risks, the more valued they'll feel as a person, and that will end up affecting them socially. And then lastly is the competency deviancy hypothesis. So basically what this means is we want these students to be able to show that they're competent beings, and that in turn will gain them respect. So you can't only teach them how to behave socially acceptably, but you also have to show them how to display competence. That includes things like, can they have proper hygiene? Can they take care of themselves? Stuff like that. If you don't show that you have competency, then it attracts a lot of negative attention from typical students. So Strain, he's done a whole bunch of research on social handicaps, and he brings up 6 major points when it comes to inclusion issues with autistic students. So for one, if we want the gains socially, we have to place them in inclusive settings. We went over that before. And interestingly, autistic students that are only in the presence of other autistic students, they have their autistic behaviors and tendencies increase. But when you put them in the presence of typical peers, their outcomes are a lot more positive, and they drop a lot of those negative behaviors. So, and another thing is, it's not just the high functioning individuals with intellectual disability that benefit from being included. Even the ones with severe disabilities, profound disabilities, those people still could really benefit by being included with the rest of their peers. A huge strategy that Strain actually talked about was educating typical students. All right, there's all this talk about educating the student with a disability, but people forget that you have to educate typical students. We talked about before how typical students don't really want to engage with their peers with disabilities. So we have to teach our students to assist and intervene with their associates in class. And honestly, that goes a lot farther than instruction from a teacher or parent or like any other adult. Students want to hear from their students. They want to, fit in, and they're a lot more likely to listen to their peers. So if you can educate typical students and teach them how to teach their peers with disabilities, that will go such a far way. So I think a lot of people forget about that, but super important. It's indispensable. So Strain also just fired off a whole bunch of myths, and he tries to disprove them. One is the tutorial instruction myth, and it falsely claims that students with autism can really only learn via one-to-one instruction. And obviously, as we know today, there's many different instructional methods for students with intellectual disabilities. The overstimulation myth is a pretty popular one, which falsely claims that students exhibit problem behaviors more often when they're in inclusive settings because it's more stimulating, and there's simply no data to back that up. And the last myth that he kind of just shut down was that you need to be in a restrictive setting to fix problem behavior. And of course, that doesn't make any sense because you want to be in the most authentic and inclusive environment to fix those things. So one last little note here that I'll talk about, there's actually some research done that it's not really the disability that causes social problems, but it's the loss of functioning and certain limitations that come with different disabilities. And that was figured out by Hearst in 1989. So basically what that's saying is, social handicap isn't a symptom of any disability, but it's more so the fact that, with these certain disabilities, you lose the ability to adjust to social situations. You have a lack of awareness, a lack of context. You become more dependent on others. You have restricted choices. And then, of course, there's physical barriers that can affect one's social life, such as, not being able to move or exercise and hang out with them, or not being able to have a social gaze. So it's not necessarily the intellectual disability that directly correlates to social problems, but we have to look a little bit deeper into why or what specific symptoms of these disabilities are causing the social problems. So that's the gist of my research paper. Super fun to learn about. Basically, people with disabilities suffer a lot socially, and the social aspect of learning is one of the most important things. We talk about it a lot in school. You learn a certain amount from your teacher, but when I look back to my elementary days, I remember hanging out with my friends and goofing off with them and stuff like that. So we have to make sure that we're getting our students in inclusive environments, educate the typical students on how to deal with these students with intellectual disabilities, and just understanding that they're going to struggle a little bit more is the key to helping out. So yeah, that's pretty much what I learned about social handicap in individuals with disabilities. Thank you guys for listening.